Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at a game that was played today in Menorca, Spain, in the Menorca Open. Now, this game featured Hans Niemann from the United States against Pranav, also known as Buddy Pranav. To those of you guys who've watched a lot of our videos of Online Blitz, he's played against Eric Hansen, myself, Magnus Carlsen, and many others. In fact, when I did my video about winning my 50th Title Tuesday event on chess.com, we had a video, so if you want to see that game, make sure to check it out in the link below. At any rate, this game happens. Let's jump right into it. So playing with the white pieces, of course, is Hans Niemann, and Pranav playing with the black pieces. Now, those of you guys who are wondering why we call him Buddy Pranav, that was a term that was coined by Eric Hansen because he was a guy that you could just play many blitz games against. So the game starts with the move d4 from Hans. We get knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, and now we get b6. Now, this opening is the Queen's Indian defense. It is an opening that was very popular in the late 1980s into the 1990s. There were many games played between Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov. In recent times, it's fallen a little bit out of favor. There was also a recent match a couple of years back between Stockfish and AlphaZero, and AlphaZero simply outclassed Stockfish. So it's not an opening that we see all that frequently. Nonetheless, it is considered to be very solid. So the game continues with g3. We get bishop to a6, attacking the pawn on c4. After b3 played to guard the pawn, we get bishop to b4 check, bishop to d2, and now this move bishop to e7. Now you're probably wondering, well, why did you play bishop b4 only to retreat the bishop? You've essentially lost a tempo for no good reason. Now, the reason for playing this move instead of just playing bishop e7 right away is that white can actually put the bishop on b2, get it on this nice diagonal, aiming towards this knight on f6, and the pawn on g7, and after castles bishop g2, let's just say d5 and knight d2, white has the perfect placement with these bishops, and white has great diagonals in the future. So when you play bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop e7, now if white wants to put the bishop on the diagonal, bishop has to go to c3, and down the road there are always moves like knight to e4, gaining a tempo on the bishop, and if you have to move the bishop, you're just losing more and more time to get it to the ideal square on b2. So after bishop to e7, we get knight to c3. Now pawn to d5 is played, a very important move. If you were to castle the king, white can play e4 and claim the big white center. So we get d5 played here, and now we get c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop g2, castles, very standard position. I myself have actually played this quite a few times with very unfortunate results. I played it in the candidates tournament against Sergei Karyakin in 2016. So after castles, we get knight b to d7, we get knight to e5, bishop b7 is played here to stop the knight from jumping to c6, bishop to f4 is played, activating the bishop on this diagonal now and aiming towards this pawn on c7. We get pawn to a6, which is played here by Buddy Pranav. Now, the reasoning behind this move is actually quite straightforward. I think at this point in the game, Buddy was a little bit worried that at some point there's going to be a move like knight to b5, and with these knights on e5 and b5, black potentially has some issues. If you play a move like c6 here, white can take the knight. If you take back, then there's knight c7, forking the rooks on e8 and a8. And if you take the knight on b5, after knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, and a move like queen to d3, white is definitely better due to the weak pawn on d5 and the fact that black has these stacked pawns on b6 and b5 as well. So we get pawn to a6 played here by Buddy. We get queen c2 played by Hans, trying to bring the queen to the queen side, maybe create a double stack on the c file and put some pressure on the pawn on c7. We get rook to e8. Now we get rook fd1, and h6 is played here. Now at this point, it's very difficult to play for black, and from my own experiences studying the Queen's Indian prior to the candidates tournament in 2016, I felt that a lot of these positions are counterintuitive. Normally what you have to play for with black is this move knight to f8 to go knight to e6 and put pressure on the bishop on f4 as well as the pawn on d4. And let's say white plays e3, you can play knight e6 here. Let's just say white plays h4 to stop g5, and now maybe you can even go c5 and try to open up the center of the board. Again, very difficult to play, but nonetheless, it's probably the best option. Instead, Buddy Pranav plays h6. We get queen to f5, knight to f8 played here. Same idea of going knight to e6. But now in this position already, after queen f5, knight f8, white has the option to start expanding on the king side with moves like h4 or even potentially g4 down the road. However, Hans plays knight g4 with the idea of trading off the knight on f6, which guards the pawn on d5. Buddy trades knights on g4, and now he plays the move knight to g6, trying to put pressure on this bishop on f4, chasing it away from targeting the pawn on c7. Game continues with bishop to e3, and now we get this move bishop a3. Apparently the computers really don't like bishop e3 because here you can go c6, consolidating your pawn chain in the center of the board, but also with white being unable to play e4 in one go, you're gonna have time to play moves like bishop b4 or bishop f6 and put pressure on the e file, as well as the pawn on d4 or the knight on c3. For example, say white plays a move like bishop c1, you can go bishop b4, pressure on the knight, pressure on the pawn, and if white could magically say play a move like e4 here, opening up the center of the board, you're gonna have this great diagonal towards this pawn on c6 and bishop on b7. And I do think white is a little bit better here. Computer thinks it's equal still, but it feels very hard to play with this awkward knight on g6. Can't really jump anywhere. Bishop on b7 isn't great. You have this weak pawn on c6. The pawn on b6 isn't great either, and white really has no major weaknesses. Even the pawn on d4, if you were to capture it, hangs the queen after bishop c3, and your queen is simply trapped in the center of the board. So in this position, instead we get bishop a3, buddy trying to be very cheeky here. If white were to play a move like h3, you have bishop b2, winning either the knight or the rook here. If you move the rook to guard the knight, after takes, you simply have a rook for a bishop. And if white were to say move the rook to b1, you simply hang the knight on c3 altogether. So in this position, we get rook a b1 to stop bishop b2. Now we get queen to d6, which apparently is a blunder. Feels like a very logical move. I can't really fault this move. It's simply an idea to stop b4. For example, I think buddy was very worried that if he plays a move like knight f8, maybe white has a move like b4, and white can even go rook b3 to try and simply trap this bishop on the edge of the board. So we get queen to d6 played here. Now we have pawn to h4 played by Hans, trying to push pawns on the king side, go h5, put pressure on the pawn on h6, and with the queen on g4 spying the pawn on g7 and the king on g8, it feels very tricky to play. So here buddy plays bishop b4. Now this is just a mistake. I think it's purely based on a miscalculation here, and Hans capitalizes with this great move pawn to h5. Now the reason that this move is so strong is on first glance you go, well, what's the big deal? Take the knight, takes, just take back, black is an extra pawn, what's going on? No biggie. But the problem is here white can now go bishop f4, and you have a lot of weaknesses here. The pawn on g6 is weak, the pawn on c7 is weak, and if you move the queen to say e7, white can actually now go rook b to c1, and your bishop is a big issue. If you move the bishop, white takes the pawn, bishop and the rook coordinate perfectly, and you will lose either your queen or your bishop. For example, you take on e2, swap the queens, and rook takes b7, and white just has an extra priest on the board. So you're in a lot of trouble here. Now I suspect buddy simply miscalculated this, but instead buddy comes up with a very original and novel concept under a lot of pressure here by sacrificing the rook with rook takes e3. Now this move is not the best move, but nonetheless it is a very, very tricky idea here, because what you're doing when you sacrifice the rook and move the knight back is white now has these double pawns. Pawns on the king side are a little bit extended as well. And if black can get f5 in and prevent this pawn push in the center, and then maybe move the queen and bring the bishop back, you're going to have major weaknesses on the king side. So here Hans plays rook d3. Now this is the start of an erroneous plan. Probably should have played rook b c1, and again, doesn't really make sense to me why this is the best move. But after a move like f5, you can go queen f4, queen d7, and now when you play knight a4, bishop d6, and move the queen to f3, you'll notice in this position it's not so obvious, but as you'll notice from the game, black's queen on d7 and knight on e7 are very passive here, and black doesn't have a clear-cut plan in order to put pressure on the pawns on g3 and h5. Whereas in the game, when we get rook to d3, f5 is played, queen to f3, rook to f8, knight a4 is played here, queen f6. You'll notice that in this position what black is getting is a bishop on d6, a nice wooden shield here. It covers a lot of diagonals, but more importantly the black queen is going to g5, and white is going to have these three weaknesses, these three pawns that can be targeted by the queen. Here Hans plays knight to b2. Now at this point players starting to get a little bit low on time, position already feeling kind of nervy for Hans, I'm sure, because you're very worried about getting attacked on the king side. And the last thing you want is some massive storm, massive king side attack where black crashes through and your king on g1 gets checkmated. So here the game continues with this move knight b2. Now this is a clear mistake, but at this point the best move would have been to play rook c1, and if black goes bishop d6, you can now play this move rook d to c3, intending to sack the rook on c7 for the bishop and the pawn. And here black is in a lot of trouble because the sacrifice is very strong for a couple of reasons. If black plays a move like queen g5, you take, and now the bishop is hanging, knight is a little bit loose, but more importantly your knight is jumping into the game by capturing this pawn on b6, and from b6 it puts pressure on the pawn on d5 as well as the d7 and e5 squares potentially. So Hans misses this. Instead he plays knight to b2. Bishop to d6 is played by Buddy, and already here it starts to feel very scary for white, because queen g5 putting pressure on g3, h5, and e3 is a huge issue, and you have this big pawn on g2, this bishop, which is just not in the game. You can't push the pawns in the center of the board, so already it's very hard to play. Game continues with this move knight to d1. Pranav plays queen g5, threatening to capture the pawn. We get knight to f2, and now we get bishop takes g3, knight to h3, queen to h4, and now Hans plays knight f4, trying to bring the knight to f4. Now it's very important here. It looks really scary after queen h2 and king f1, but black doesn't have a clear-cut way to break through. You can't really push the g pawn, you can't push the f pawn. If you take, I take back with the pawn, and now I have queen h3 or queen g3, and suddenly white is completely fine. So even though the computer actually thinks that in this position, after queen h2 and king c1, knight to c8 is close to winning because you have knight d6 and knight to e4 jumping with this knight, it's very hard for a human to find this setup. So instead, Buddy decides to play another logical plan by going bishop to c6. Now the idea behind bishop c6 is you can play bishop b5, attacking the rook on d3, or you can play bishop e8 and try to win the pawn on h5. Game continues with bishop to h3. We get bishop takes f4. Now this is a slight mistake by Buddy here. He should have played this move bishop t8 right away, but again, very hard to fault him for not playing this move, because on first glance, after knight takes pawn, takes king h8, you just think white goes queen g2. What's the big deal? If you take the pawn on h5, for example, white can go rook f1, and even though you have the two bishops on the king side with the queen, you can't really do the rook lift operation here with rook f6 and rook g6, because after rook f6 you hang the pawn on f5. So because of that, from a distance, not being able to calculate due to not that much time, very hard to spot this. And this is one of those situations where we really learn how strong computers are, because in this position the computer actually likes this move pawn to g5, offering white the opportunity to play en passant with pawn takes pawn. But after takes and rook to f6, now the rook lift operation is going to be successful, and white is in a lot of trouble here. But again, very difficult plan to find with not a lot of time on the clock. It's not intuitive in any shape or form, and Buddy doesn't do it. Instead, he decides to take on f4 first, and now he goes bishop to e8, intending to gobble a second pawn on h5. As we take stock of the position here, you'll notice that black has a knight and a pawn for a rook, but he's going to get a second pawn as well, so Pranav is doing quite well. Game continues with bishop to g2. We get c6 here, trying to overprotect the pawn on d5. b4 is played here, stopping c5 or a5. We get knight to c8. Queen to e3 is played, keeping an eye on the bishop, but also stopping black from playing knight to d6 here, because then there's queen to e6 check. And now if you move the king, spaghetti-o, you lose the pony. And if you block with the knight on f7, now white can simply play rook f1. Their ideas like rook e3, or even bringing the other rook to f3 and h3, and white is much better here. So the game continues with bishop to d7, stopping this move queen to e6. Hans plays rook a3, an excellent move with little time left on the clock, because now white wants to activate the rook on this a file. And as we saw in the Dean game earlier today, if you can get rooks on open files, they're very powerful. But if they get stuck on sort of these closed files, like in this game the d or the b file or even the c file, they're not as effective. So rook a3 is an excellent move. Buddy plays rook to e8. We get queen to f3, sidestepping the rook threat, but also guarding both h5 and e2. Buddy plays knight to d6. Rook to a6 is played here, and now we get this move knight to c4. Now apparently this move is a blunder, but I really like this move, because what it does is it guards the pawn on b6 from being captured. You also threaten to fork the queen and the rook with knight to d2, but you can also jump with the knight to e3 as well. So game continues with queen f2. We get queen takes h5, bishop to f3, attacking the queen, guarding the pawn on e2. Queen g6, queen g2 is played here. Now again, it's worth noting that in this tournament being played in Menorca, Spain, there is no secondary time control. So at this point, when Hans has 2 minutes and Buddy Pranav has 19 minutes, you get no more time for the rest of the game, so you just gotta go. So we get queen g2, queen to d6 is played here. Now apparently queen f6 is a little bit better, but queen d6 is played. Rook to a7 played by Hans here, trying to put pressure on the 7th rank, maybe create some kebabs along the way. And here if black moves the bishop, it's checkmate in 1. So Buddy plays rook to d8, which is again apparently a mistake, but hard to really fault him for playing this move. As you guard the bishop on d7, he probably didn't want to play rook e7, which is a better move, simply because white can play rook to a8 check, or maybe even b5, and you worry that there are going to be some exchanges on the 7th rank. So he goes rook to d8, and here Hans blunders by playing this move pawn to b5. Now this move doesn't lose the game on the spot, but it allows black a very tricky tactic, which Buddy misses. In this position, black can play knight to a3, forking the rook on b1 as well as the pawn on b5. And in this position, If white moves the rook to say d1, after knight takes b5, black is simply winning here. You have a knight and 2 pawns for the rook. f4 is weak, d4 is weak as well. Right triangles abound here, and it should be losing in the long run. At any rate, Buddy doesn't spot that. Again, trying to play quickly, put pressure on Hans on the clock. He decides to take the pawn. We get bishop takes d5, which very counterintuitively is a mistake, because what it does is now it actually justifies having the rook and the queen on the d file here. What Hans should have played was this move queen to f2, because now if you take the pawn, this walks into the classic fossil with bishop takes d5 check, and when you move the king, you do a Botez gambit and lose your queen. And in this position, black probably plays king h7 and black is for choice, but again, it's not so obvious what your plan is after white plays a move like queen to g3 or even queen to h4 for that matter, because you have a lot of issues. The rook on a7 is very strong. You can't really move the knight easily. You have these stacked pawns, no real pawn breaks here. Even if you get rook e8, you're not threatening anything on this e file, so there's still a lot of play for both sides. But once Hans grabs the pawn, being greedy here, tries to take the pawn, we get king to h7. In this position, now the d file is going to open up, and now Buddy is definitely on the right side of equality. He's going to have the best chance to win this game, and Hans' chances of winning this game and climbing the rankings start to dwindle as the game proceeds. Here we get rook to b3 being played, and now we have queen takes f4, gobbling this pawn. Hans plays queen to f2. Now, I don't know what Hans saw here. Maybe thought he had like rook g3, trying to stack everything on the g file. But now after queen takes d4, king to h1, and knight to e3, white is simply lost due to the fork of the queen and the bishop. The queen on d4 guards g7 as well. And white is going to end up with a rook against a knight and a bishop. And with such limited material on the board, this will be losing. So in this position, we get queen to f2 again. Now we get queen to d6 played by Buddy. Very solid move, because as you'll notice here, this knight on c4 is very, very rock solid with the 2 pawns here. If white ever takes, you take, you undouble the pawns, and now after b5, suddenly white has a naked king on g1. You have pawns pushing up the queen side. You can even start pushing p on the king side, and it's a complete disaster. So in this position, we get the move bishop to g2. Now f4 is played by Buddy. Very solid move here, trying to create a bastion with the knight on e3. Hans plays rook to f3, and now we get this move rook f8 played after a long think. Now, oddly enough, the computer likes this move g5 more, and after bishop to h3, it simply wants to go king g6 or king g8, and it claims that black is completely fine. But again, for a human to play this move g5, opening all kinds of pins on the 7th rank, weakening your king position, it's just not realistic with only 9 minutes on the clock. If you have maybe 30-40 minutes, I could see it, but with only 9 minutes, very, very hard to play this move. So Buddy plays rook f8 instead to guard the pawn on f4 with the rook and the queen. Here Hans sacks the rook on d7. Queen takes, rook takes f4. We get the swap, and at this point we've somewhat simplified the position here. Both sides have sacked the rook, and at this point black has an extra pawn, but the problem is the extra pawn that black has is a stacked pawn on b5. And so effectively we have even material here, with black having 2 connected pawns on the king side versus white with 2 connected pawns in the center of the board. I would say in general it feels a little bit scary to play this for black, just due to the fact that the bishop can come to e4 and create a wooden shield. On the other hand, white can't easily push the pawns. So for example, in this position after g6, white can't just go e4 trying to push p, because then you hang the pawn on d4. And if you play d5 here after queen e7 e4 and a move like knight to e5 or even king g7, black blockades the pawns on the dark squares, and white cannot push the pawns further up the board. So in this position, we get queen to f2 played by Hans, trying to push e4 because now the queen guards the pawn. We get queen to e7, e4 is played, king to g7, Hans plays e5, we get queen g5, and now king to h2 is played, and this is a mistake. Now it's very clear that at this point Hans was thinking, I'm going to win this game, I'm the better player, I'm all in on the win, there's no way that I can lose here. But Hans starts to lose his objectivity in this position. What he should play is this move queen to f3, because now if black ever tries to trade the queens after knight takes and bishop to c6, again the pawns are very fast going up the board here. It's not really clear. I mean, maybe black can go knight c2 and some kind of knight b4, but to allow this position after a3 where the pawns are really fast, it's very, very scary, very hard to play, and I'm not sure that Buddy would have gone for this variation at all. Instead, Hans plays king to h2. We get knight to e3, threatening to fork the king and the queen with knight to g4. We get bishop to h3, knight to d5 is played here, blockading the pawns now, and Hans plays bishop g2. We get knight to f4, and now Hans makes a huge mistake by playing this move bishop f1. Now already here it's very, very hard to play for white because there's no clear-cut plan. You can't push the pawns. d5 hangs e5, e6 simply hangs the pawn, so pawns are kind of stuck here. You can't easily push them up the board. Additionally, the knife on f4 with the queen on g5 is very, very powerful. It's a very hard position to play, and with limited time on the clock to boot, it's almost impossible. Now it's worth noting here that bishop e4 is another move that on first glance looks good, but after queen to h5, white loses the game. If you go king g1, I have knight h3, forking the king and the queen. And if you go king g3, queen h3, king takes f4, I can play g5 here, which is simply checkmate. The king has no squares that it can move to. So in this position, we get bishop to f1. We get b4 being played by Pranav, and now queen f3. Again, bishop c4 here would be a mistake, because after queen to h5, king g3, and g5, black is threatening queen h3, and black should be winning. So we get queen to f3. Pranav plays h5 here, simply because now if white checks on b7, you escape on h6. If you play just a move like b5, white can at the very least simply make a draw here by checking on these last two ranks. So the game would be a draw. So Buddy plays h5, creating a square for the king on h6. Hans plays bishop c4, and this effectively loses the game. Now again, very hard to be critical of the moves here at this point. Both players low on time. Much easier for black to play due to the king safety, the knife on f4, queen on g5, obvious checks lurking. And so if you're playing with the white pieces here, you always have to double check every line to make sure you're not blundering a fork or a checkmate. So Hans plays bishop c4. We get king to h6. Now this is a mistake here. Queen h4 is apparently winning, because after king g1, you can play this very counterintuitive idea with queen e1, bishop to f1, and just g5. Now again, to play this in a game is completely insane, because what ends up happening here is that you start running your king up the board to either e4 or g4, and in a realistic practical situation in a game, no human is going to do this unless they have like 10 or 15 minutes on the clock. So with limited time, Buddy decides to play king h6. We get bishop to b3 being played by Hans, and this loses the game. Now already here, very difficult. Apparently bishop f1 and white is still in the game, but at this point, if you're playing the position, you don't really want to go back. It feels like you've already lost the initiative. If black can keep pushing the pawns up the board, getting this pawn to h4, maybe a pawn to g5, and you're not able to push the pawns in the center up the board, it just does not feel right from an intuitive standpoint. So here Hans plays bishop b3, but now after queen to h4, king g1, queen e1, the game is lost. We get king to h2, queen to d2 check is played, checking the king and attacking the pawn on d4. We get king h1, Buddy checks. We get king h2, queen b2, king h1, and here Buddy plays the unusual move queen a1. Now it's worth noting in this position, if you simply grab the pawn on d4, there are no threats here. There is no boogeyman. I'm sure Buddy thought that he saw the boogeyman in this position, which is why he didn't play it. But after queen takes d4, if white goes queen a8, you simply take the pawn and the queen covers the mating squares, and you're simply winning. And if white plays e6 here, you can go queen a1, king h2, and now the all-important move, queen to e5, threatening to capture the pawn on e6. If white plays a move like queen g3, you simply go queen to e2 check, king moves, and you take the pawn, and you win the game. You're simply up 3 extra pawns here. So instead, we get queen to a1, queen to d1. Sorry, I forgot there's one other line I want to point out, which is after king to h1 takes, e6 check, king h2, queen e5, e7, for example. If you take on e7, you hang the knight. But here, you can simply play knight to d5, king h1, knight takes pawn, queen f8, and king g5, and your king is very safe. No checks on the dark squares, queen guards the knight, and it's game over as well. Instead, we get queen to a1. Here, Hans decides to gamble by playing queen to d1. Now, the problem with playing queen to d1 here is now it forces black into making only moves that are not difficult to find at all. Buddy plays queen to c3, threatening to go for mate in 2. So if you push p, I go check and mate. So Hans has to play queen c2 here, and now Buddy takes on d4. Now it's worth noting in this position, queen to e1 wins on the spot, because after king h2 and knight to e2, you're threatening a very nasty checkmate with either queen g3 or queen g1, with the knight covering 2 critical squares. Now probably Buddy low on time, again trying not to see the boogeyman. He probably missed it after king g2. You can go queen g1 check. If king h3, it's mate in 1, and if king f3, you play knight takes pawn, forking the king and the queen. So this would have won on the spot, but again, without like tons of time, Buddy just trying to be very solid, not allow any tricks, not allow any nonsense to happen, decides to take the pawn on d4. Now Hans plays e6, we get queen to a1, king to h2, and now Buddy plays knight takes e6, which is a very, very good practical move, because now there are no tricks. If white, for example, takes the knight, you go queen e5 check, and you collect the bishop, and this endgame is simply cleanly winning. You have 3 extra pawns here, and for a player of Buddy's caliber, no chance of messing this up. So Hans plays queen d2 check, Buddy plays knight g5, king guards the knight, and now the rest is very basic. Black has 3 extra pawns here, and white's bishop can't even attack any of these pawns, so it's game over. Hans plays queen to d6, and now Buddy plays this peculiar move, queen b2. In this position, queen to e5 simply wins the game on the spot because you're checking the king and attacking the queen. White has to take the queen, and after knight to f3, forking the king and the queen, let's say king g3 takes, king f4, knight d3, king e3, and knight c5. Black has 3 extra pawns here. You're simply pushing the h and the g pawns up the board. White can do absolutely nothing, and I'm quite convinced Hans would have resigned. Instead, we get this move, queen b2 check, king h1, queen to c1 is played, and now we get king g2, queen to c5, simply stopping, queen to f8 check, queen to f6 played by Hans, again trying desperately to create some kind of counterplay with threats like queen h8. And now Buddy plays this move, knight to h7. Again, maybe not the absolute best move, but he's just making sure that the king is completely safe. Knight covers f8, you can swing the queen to g5, and then with a wide open king on g2, there's nothing that white can do. Hans plays queen f7, we get queen to g5 check, king to h1. I don't know what that glitch is on the board. It said mate and 12 for white. I don't know why. We get queen to e5, and now Buddy has centralized the queen. Still no checks on either f8 or f4 here, and the rest is very basic. We get queen b7, queen e1, king g2, queen to e2, and here Buddy here Hans resigns the position. The game probably would have continued with king h1 check, king h2, queen f2, king h1, and then knight to g5 here with ideas like knight to f3, queen f3, etc. At the very least, Black will be able to trade off the queens, if not a forced checkmate with moves like knight f3. So because of that, Hans resigns this game. Buddy gets a huge win over a 2700 GM. He moves up into the lead. He's tied for first place in this critical tournament, the Menorca Open 2023. So great victory for Buddy over Hans, and we're going to see what happens in the rest of the event for both players. But really great to see a player who I've played so many times against in so many blitz games, gotten loads of experience against myself, against Eric Hansen, and many others, and it's great to see him performing. He's definitely a rising star from India that we want to watch. On that note, you guys, I hope you've enjoyed this recap, and make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and we'll be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys soon. Bye.